So this news starts with a question. Is punishing someone, even someone who deserves it, even someone who really deserves it, is it worth it if it also means punishing millions more? Because the US government, time and time again, has answered yes to that question. And they've done it, time and time again, by imposing economic sanctions despite concerns over their efficacy and impact, right? Because the reality is that sanctions tend to fail more than they succeed. And on top of hurting innocent people, they can even backfire in all sorts of ways you might not expect, like driving migration, actually enriching those they were meant to target, and even fueling the drug trade in the Middle East. But despite all those concerns, the US is now using sanctions more than ever. In fact, since 9/11, the number of entities sanctioned by the US government has grown by almost 1,000%, with now the US having more than 15,000 sanctions in place, which notably is 3 times as many as any other country or international body. Now with that said, I don't want to paint this issue as black and white, right? Policymakers often claim that sanctions aren't actually punitive. Instead, they say they're just about pressuring these individuals, organizations, or governments to change their behavior. And they do sometimes work, right? In South Africa, for example, many people say they helped end apartheid. And beyond that, they've also allowed the US to take not only moral, but also economically meaningful stands against not only governments, but individuals or groups who violate human rights or commit war crimes. And very importantly, they do it all without putting a single one of our soldiers in harm's way. Or they're seen as being in this sweet spot between doing nothing and sending in troops. And as far as potential collateral damage, there are mechanisms meant to minimize that, right? There have long been so-called humanitarian exemptions to allow the delivery of aid into affected countries. And in fact, the Biden administration led the way in developing and implementing a UN resolution on humanitarian sanctions exemptions. But despite that, studies often show that broad sanctions have a significant negative impact on things like income, poverty, mortality, and human rights. And even though there's this whole idea of targeted or smart sanctions that aim to deal with that, focusing their attention on specific individuals or institutions to minimize the suffering of innocent civilians, it's not clear they're much better. Or you've got people like George Lopez, one of the people who actually popularized the idea of smart sanctions more than 20 years ago, telling the Washington Post, smart sanctions were meant to be a buffet of choices where you fit the particular imposed sanction to the offense and vulnerability of the country. Instead, policymakers walked into the buffet and said, I'm gonna pile everything onto my plate. And at that point, back in 2017, some argued that Trump's new smart sanctions on Venezuela could lead the country back to democracy. But then, 2 years later, the administration imposed the most sweeping sanctions the country has ever seen, and targeting the government of Nicolas Maduro. Because on top of being accused of corruption, widespread human rights violations, and bringing the country toward economic crisis, Maduro also won a second term in office in 2018 in an election widely seen as fraudulent. But 6 years later, the abuses have continued, and Maduro has seemingly stolen another election. And so while there was briefly hope that sanctions would work, now all they seem to have done is accelerate the country's economic collapse. Right? In the one peer-reviewed academic study that tried to quantify it, it found that sanctions were responsible for about half of Venezuela's economic contraction, which the author estimated was 3 times as deep as our Great Depression. And with that, millions of Venezuelans have been driven to flee the country. I mean, it is the largest migration crisis in the Western Hemisphere. Now also, to be clear, some people claim that the sanctions didn't have anything to do with the economic or migration crisis. Right? They correctly point out that Venezuela's economy was already going to hell. And some claim that increased migration had more to do with Biden's handling of the border. But then you also have folks like Democratic Representative Jim McGovern writing in 2021, although US officials regularly say that the sanctions target the government and not the people, the whole point of the maximum pressure campaign is to increase the economic cost to Venezuela of failing to comply with conditions the US imposes. Economic pain is the means by which the sanctions are supposed to work. And adding, but it is not Venezuelan officials who suffer the costs, it is the Venezuelan people. And in fact, for some people in the Trump campaign, they didn't even hide that that was the point. Right back in 2019, Trump's Secretary of State Mike Pompeo seemingly acknowledged the rationale behind the sanctions.
It doesn't take much for you to see what's really going on there. The circle is tightening. The humanitarian crisis is increasing by the hour. You can see the increasing pain and suffering that the Venezuelan people are suffering from.
And notably, that is the type of point that he made again and again when it came to sanctions, right? Like when he was talking about Iran, he said,
things are much worse for the Iranian people, and we're convinced that will lead the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime.
The man also reportedly telling European diplomats that the maximum pressure strategy was designed to starve Cuba in order to bring down the government. Now with all that, I don't want to make this out to be some sort of totally partisan issue. Right? While Biden has said that he'd use sanctions more sparingly when he came to office, he actually kept a lot of Trump's sanctions in place, with him also, in fact, adding to them. Though a lot of that had to do with Russia's full-scale invasion, which led to Biden rolling out an unprecedented 6,000 sanctions in just 2 years. But this also, as his administration has sanctioned Israeli settlers in the West Bank, former government officials officials in Afghanistan and alleged fentanyl dealers in Mexico, right? And that's not to say that any of those decisions were good or bad, but to say that the US does it a lot. And that last one does raise an interesting point, right? Because while the US is using sanctions to try and curb the illegal drug trade in this hemisphere, American sanctions are actually contributing to the illegal drug trade in the other. And specifically here, I'm talking about Syria, because in 2020, Congress passed the Caesar Syrian Civil Protection Act, with it named after a Syrian defector who smuggled out evidence of atrocities committed by the Assad regime. And with that, the sanctions are supposed to get Assad's government to, quote, halt its murderous attacks on the Syrian people and to support a transition to a government in Syria that respects the rule of law, human rights, and peaceful coexistence with its neighbors. But right from the beginning, you had people warning that the sanctions could devastate Syria's already failing economy. Right? Julian Barnes-Dacey from the European Council on Foreign Relations saying at the time that Assad is absolutely the prime driver of Syria's ongoing collapse. But then adding that the US position now appears to be fundamentally driven by great power politics and the goal of ensuring that Russia and Iran can't claim a win. And going on to say, my fear is that Caesar will achieve the exact opposite of its stated goal, fueling the worst impulses of the Syrian regime and wider conflict. And now, a few years later, we've certainly seen that. Right? At least 12 million Syrians are now refugees or internally displaced. 90% of people live in poverty, and the country's GDP fell from a pre-war high of $252 billion to just $9 billion in 2021. And whatever role sanctions played in that, one thing they definitely contributed to was the trade of a drug called Captagon, which is a synthetic stimulant that costs less than $1 to make, but fetches up to $20 each on the street. And it's now one of the big reasons that Assad is still in power. With Joel Rayburn, the US envoy to Syria from 2018 to 2021, actually telling the Post, this is the stream of revenue on which Syria's ruling class are relying on in the face of sanctions pressure from us and from the European Union. The Assad regime could not withstand robust sanctions enforcement except for Captagon. There is no other source of revenue that can make up for what they lost due to sanctions enforcement. And with that, you have US officials saying that Syria now produces most of the world's Captagon supply, with factories in the country reportedly exporting $10 billion worth of illicit drugs each year. And so also with that, Assad is now reportedly wealthier than ever, with a 2023 study, for example, estimating that Captagon generates about $2.4 billion a year for the Assad regime, which is, quote, well above any other single licit or illicit source of revenue. And then, the knock-on effects from this just continue, right? It's increasingly become the drug of choice among the youth in Gulf Arab states, and especially in Saudi Arabia. And now there are concerns that Captagon, sometimes called the poor man's cocaine, could hit Europe next. And so the question with that now is, as much as Assad deserved to be punished, was it worth it? To be clear, it is not an easy answer. You got folks like the executive director of the Syrian Emergency Task Force saying, the Caesar Act, along with new sanctions put in place targeting the Captagon trade, quote, sends an important signal to the Assad regime and its allies that the United States is standing with ordinary Syrians. And with that, noting that there are strict humanitarian exceptions to ensure that no Syrian civilians, regardless of their political outlook, are harmed by these sanctions. But of course, with the rest of what we've talked about here, there's a real debate, especially going back to the broader question of sanctions and how often they're used. And in fact, people in the highest levels of the US government have been seeing the over-reliance on sanctions as a problem for years. Right? I mean, back in 2016, Obama's Treasury Secretary warned that the overuse of sanctions could ultimately reduce our capability to use sanctions effectively. Right? Because at a certain point, if so many sanctions are in place that no one can get anything done, people will find ways to do business outside of American markets and without the US dollar. And so with that, we actually had Obama lifting a bunch of sanctions before he left office. But that's something that couldn't stop the trend. And so you had people like William Enright, a former Clinton official, explaining, it is the only thing between diplomacy and war, and as such has become the most important foreign policy tool in the US arsenal. And yet nobody in government is sure this whole strategy is even working. And this, as Ben Rhodes, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor in the Obama administration, said, the mentality, almost a weird reflex in Washington, has just become, if something bad happens anywhere in the world, the US is going to sanction some people. And that doesn't make sense. We don't think about the collateral damage of sanctions the same way we think about the collateral damage of war, but we should. And so right now, as this debate continues, I gotta pass the question off to you. Where do you land on it? What are you thinking and why?